Welcome to the Magical Overthinkers podcast, a show for thought spiralers, exploring the subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from monogamy to narcissism. If you can connect to the idea that despite living in the information age, life only seems to be making less sense, if you can't help but feel like, for some mysterious reason, it just feels especially impossible to exist as a human in the world right now, then you're in the right place. This podcast is here to soften the clash between our innate human mysticisms and the overwhelm of this time, to help quiet the cacophony in our minds for a little, or even hear a melody in it. I'm your host, Amanda Montell. Today, we're overthinking about resilience. I will never forget the first time I was on the recipient end of a resilience lecture. It was the first day of 9th grade. I was just starting at a new high school, and the vice principal came to the new 9th grade student body to give an assembly. And the main thing I remember her expressing during her speech was this notion that we as students needed to have grit. If we wanted to succeed in school and make friends and hopefully get into an amazing college, no matter what challenges were thrown our way, we needed to buckle down and be resilient. And as much as I saw the value in the general wisdom that when life gets you down or presents adversity, you should maintain hope or take steps necessary not to let it totally bring you to your knees forever, I also found that as a piece of one-size-fits-all inspiration, be resilient left something to be desired. I came to learn that resilience mantra was not exclusive to my 9th grade first day of school assembly. In the early to mid 2000s, it was everywhere. And later in this episode, when I chat with my very special guest, feminist writer and activist Soraya Chemaly, author of the new book, The Resilience Myth, we're going to unpack the cultural context that backdrops resilience messaging. But now that I'm an adult and using social media, I have been seeing a lot of criticism of that resilience advice that so many folks my age received as kids. There's a very popular tweet that gets passed around that says something along the lines of, "I hope never to be called resilient again, ever in my life." Because many of us have had this intuition that we're now trying to concretely articulate, that there has to be a better solution to moments of pain or loneliness or hardship other than this abstract notion of mental toughness. At the moment, resilience does seem to be this buzzy topic, this thing that it feels like everybody needs right now, but nobody has. My guest today, Soraya Chemaly, who has done years of reporting on the idea of resilience, says that her new book is, quote, arguing that our modern version of resilience is a bill of goods sold to us by capitalism, colonialism, and ideologies that embrace supremacy over others. One of the life moments that led up to Soraya's writing of this new book, The Resilience Myth, was the fact that her husband was diagnosed with cancer in 2016, and suddenly notions of resilience were more present in her life than ever. In an interview with Anne Helen Peterson for her newsletter Culture Study, Soraya Chemaly said that before her husband's diagnosis, her personal idea of resilience was a common one. She thought of it entirely on personal terms, that resilience had to do with grit, positive thinking, perseverance. And only when her family was thrown into this crisis did it become clear that nothing she could possibly do as an individual person could compare to what the family actually needed, which was a combination of things that had nothing to do with individual resilience, but rather compassionate listeners, friendship, and of course, material resources, including access to effective healthcare. Because the truth is that our societal perception of resilience is incredibly limiting and militaristic, prioritizing self-sufficiency and dominance, rather than what are actually the integral aspects of resilience like compassion, empathy, and creativity. which are so often shunned from the version of war tank resilience that is sold to us. In her book, Soraya notes a gendered undertone to discussions of resilience and a general demonization of the feminine. She says, quote, "The value we place on a narrowly circumscribed strength justifies a specific type of gendered power." The result of all this resilience rhetoric is, to put it simply, a lot of systemic issues just going unacknowledged and a lot of damage going unhealed, thanks to an overemphasis on vague, violence-coded notions of toughing it out. And ironically, in the long term, all of this actually makes us less resilient. I have made the mistake of perpetuating resilience messaging. And I guess how could I not when it's so prevalent? Upon a slightly closer look, I could not believe how many heavily repeated resilience idioms could be found in American English. Like that we just need to bounce back, rise from the ashes, be tough as nails, keep your chin up, keep on keeping on, stand tall, and when the going gets tough, the tough get going. I actually remember once, and I'm not proud of this, telling my partner to have more resilience in the middle of a conflict that, I guess if I'm honest, I just didn't really want to have to confront or unpack fully. So I just said that, and let me tell you, it was not inspirational or helpful to him. It actually made him feel alone. So I learned my lesson there. But then I overthink it because this messaging is so pervasive, and maybe I'm just so deeply conditioned to subscribe to it that I'm like, well, what is the alternative in the face of adversity if you don't want to just sit around and wait for top-down changes outside of your control? And I have engaged in certain tough self-love practices to get through painful challenges, like, and I know my love of cold plunging is well documented on this podcast, submerging myself in 46-degree water for 2 minutes at a time and whisper screaming to myself, "You can do anything!" I believe that practice has helped me generate at least a little bit of long-term resilience, but maybe that's just plain delusional. Maybe my understanding of resilience is truly all wrong. And then, what's worse, I have to ask, is my buying into the myth of resilience preventing me from being fully present in my social community in a way that might actually be more helpful? To help soothe all of these thought spirals surrounding the subject of resilience, I'm thrilled to introduce my special guest, Soraya Chemaly, author of the new book, The Resilience Myth. Soraya says that this book was actually the result of a whole bunch of overthinking on the topic, so she's really the perfect guest today. And with that, allow me to introduce my conversation with Soraya, Overthinking about resilience. Soraya, such a delight to see your face, as always. Smiling, shiny, fresh off a vacation, okay? Where one does not have to be so resilient. Could you please, for those who dare not to know, introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. So I'm a feminist writer, journalist, activist. I did this in college a very long time ago, and then I went off into the world thinking I would take my feminist self into an ever more feminist world and was rudely shocked and really grew increasingly disturbed by the direction of things. And then I had 3 daughters in 2 years, which will really do things to you. And then about 2010, I really felt that I had to get back to feminist activism full time. And the only way I could do that was to write. So I had been a marketing executive, strategic planning, market development. And I thought, what's going on in feminism? Because there's all this amazing academic work, actually not unlike what you've done, to translate it into popular culture, right? And I thought, well, one thing I can do is write. But what happened when I started writing in 2010 was that was this sort of real turning point year for online racism and misogyny, vitriol. It was quite astounding, actually. And then a whole group of us formed a coalition to fight social media companies and their policies of content moderation. So I wore that hat. I had a split brain between the freedom of speech activism that was driven by feminism and feminist writing, which I continue to do.
So the topic of today is resilience, and I have so many questions for you. But first, I want to pose the opening question that I ask all of my Magical Overthinkers guests, which is, what is an irrational thought spiral that has been living rent-free in your head lately?
Oh my God, what a great question. Honestly, this is my irrational thought spiral that I'm plaguing every person that I'm close enough to just vomit my thoughts at. And I'm like, I'm really seeing all these patterns online of this incredible, very brazen misogyny happening. Not just the awfulness of the violence that we are seeing, and it's seeing in spades during this time, but just patterns that I would otherwise describe as the patterns of grooming for sexual predators, but ported over into the recruitment of young boys and men into increasingly radicalized sort of men's rights, PUA, incel spaces that ultimately are always supremacist, male supremacist, white supremacist. I see that happening in very obvious ways online that you wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. And what I think is, oh my God, this is Russia fucking with our electorate to make the gender polarization that we have much more extreme.
What are some of those obvious examples that you've clocked?
So this is just anecdotal, but now I've now seen it several times. And there are these large Instagram accounts dedicated to nature. So it might be astronomy, it might be whales, it might be fuzzy animals, hundreds of thousands of followers, right? And very often very young people, because parents think this is nature, it's safe, et cetera, et cetera. And randomly, a reel will appear that looks like the first few minutes of a porn movie. So you've got like 500 reels of whales, and then you have a woman in very few clothes with a guy not being pictured who's slapping her ass as she looks fake scared. And it's quite jarring. And then there's a set of comments, and the comments more or less are the same on all of these accounts and these videos. And the comments are, what the hell is this doing here? I let my kid watch this, blah, 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 blah. And then another comment will say, oh, they must have been hacked. It's almost the same set of comments.
Whoa.
And I'm thinking, what are the chances? And honestly, if those accounts had been hacked, then their owners would remove the video, right?
Yes.
But the videos are never removed. So then I think, well, maybe they're being paid to post these videos for a short period of time during which young men, especially who are interested in science, might leap over to it. This is where my brain is going because I've seen it in gaming for so long.
Yeah. So it's like gateway incel SpawnCon.
Yeah, it is. That's what it looks like. If the comments weren't so similar across these radically, weirdly different accounts, you'd wonder. You'd be like, what? Why is it the same conversation? Why is the video not coming down? There's the outrage, and then there's the pushback, and then there's the, oh, it's a mistake. But really?
Yeah, it's hard not to feel a little paranoid about what might be going on there.
Well, the thing about it is, that is how it's worked in gaming.
Yeah.
And we know how gaming is a communications management platform for all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the games being played. Anyway, that's how deep into the weeds my spiral goes. Feel free to laugh.
No, listen, I am always so glad that I ask that question because it's disarming, but also even the most level-headed, disciplined, well-educated scholars of various fields thought spiral and get really in their feelings and really in their heads about whatever is going on in their algorithm or in their life. And most of the people that I pose this question to are spinning out about something quite existential. And it's sad to see, but it's also oh, I'm glad it's not just me.
No. That just happened to be the one that's top of mind.
The one that's top of mind today on September 10th.
That's right.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Something that I think is really valuable and kind of underrated about therapy is that it can help you not only contend with your problems or sort out why you're feeling the way that you're feeling in a practical way, it can also help you develop a sense of curiosity about the way that your brain works. And that sense of wonder about the mind can be healing in itself. There have been certain moments in my therapy journey where asking questions about why the mind works the way it does and how it responds to certain events in order to protect me in a way that might have some unpleasant side effects has really helped me gain some perspective and humility in the whole process. I actually tried BetterHelp a few years ago, and it was a really useful tool for me during that time. It was actually during the pandemic, so I couldn't access my in-person therapist. Using BetterHelp BetterHelp for online therapy was super convenient and sort of helped tide me over during a really difficult and disconnected time. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/magical today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/magical. So let's pivot to the central theme of today, overthinking about resilience. You've penned a beautiful book called The Resilience Myth that I've recommended on my newsletters, as well as many other platforms. Everybody check it out. But I was wondering if you could share with the listeners what, from your life and experience, brought you to want to tackle this subject matter in book form.
Sure. I didn't want to tackle this subject in book form. I was drawn into tackling this subject from a starting point, which was, why is it that our society doesn't value care work, people who provide care, having an ethos of care? Why is it that we devalue women's labor, women's time? And this was just before the pandemic. My book proposal on that topic was in discussions in January of 2020. And then the pandemic hit. And in March of that year, towards the end of March, early April, I wrote a piece calling it the patriarchal pandemic, explaining how we wouldn't all be affected the same way by this pandemic, and that it would end up being a form of patriarchal violence in societies, because certain populations would just bear the cost of this pandemic in ways other populations wouldn't have to. And that then became, with my editor, a discussion that she felt was about trauma and I thought was more about grief. And so she said, well, I'd like you to write about that. And I said, well, we can call it anything we want, but I'm going to be writing about care. And if that's fine with you, we'll move forward. And so I ended up framing it around resilience. In fact, because we don't have an ethic of care, we demand resilience that in the end isn't actually about positive adaptation at all. It's really about navigating brutalization that can be avoided, that can be mitigated, that can be addressed through fairer resource distribution and social justice. And that's how I ended up with this book.
Yeah, I'm so glad you made this distinction that you didn't think it would be like a delightful exercise.
Delightful thing to spend 3 years
right.
on.
No, it's painful to write a book like this, but I imagine validating and empowering in other ways. It can be challenging to eat of the fruit of knowledge on a subject that is so visceral.
Yeah, and also in an industry that's falling apart.
Which one? Publishing, America. I mean, the business of America.
That's right. I mean, it's both publishing and capitalism, but really, I mean, I know you and I both are familiar with this, but publishing, it's not an industry that functions well in the current environment.
Oh, I have no idea what you're talking about.
No idea. And so, a book that really should have taken 18 months ended up taking 3 years. So it's hard. You know this. You immerse yourself in a subject, and it's everything you're doing. It occupies all of your, not just awake thoughts, your sleep thoughts.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, no matter the timeline, unfortunately and fortunately, this book has landed at what feels like a very necessary time. We need this problematization of resilience messaging. I would love to ask you some questions about what resilience means and what it doesn't mean, what it should mean. And I want to start by talking about the history of this word, the recent etymology of this word. I learned in your book that in the 1970s, an ecologist by the name of Buzz Holling used this word resilience to describe a system that maintains stability as it changes, leading the term to boom in popularity amongst those who study development and human responses to traumatic events. Can you talk more about when this word really entered the lexicon and what culturally was going on at that time that gave an engine to it?
Sure. I think there were two main turning points. One was definitely Hollings's application of the idea of resilience, as you just described it, in complicated systems. He was an ecologist. Prior to that, people, particularly mechanical science people, used it to describe metal tensile qualities of metal, that metal could return to its original state. That idea of an original state in the English language, this really makes me laugh, actually came from its first English language kind of recorded use, which was Henry VIII trying to get a divorce from his wife Catherine. And in the petition, they used the word resilient to mean that he would return to his pre-marriage state.
Oh.
Isn't that funny? Mm-hmm. That did not cling, but then Isaac Newton used it for scientific reasons, and that pretty much stayed. It wasn't very common, but it had that usage until Hollings kind of exploded it. Systems science was really exploding at that time. But people realized there are many types of complicated systems. So childhood development, for example, can be seen as a complicated system, where how do you apply systems science to development, which a lot of child psychologists started doing. The idea of resilience was always important in war because you needed soldiers to get back out there and fight. But the term resilience wasn't so much used. There were lots of other things like post-traumatic stress eventually became a word. But from sort of the Civil War on, every single war developed its own canon of language and how soldiers can or should respond. But the word itself really took off when Hollings did that. And then again, about 25 years later, when positive psychology started to take off, the idea, the quality of being a resilient person was really important to positive psychology. And then I would say that those two things, Hollings and positive psychology, really take us to 9/11. Because when 9/11 happened, the country immediately turned into a wartime state in which being resilient, in which resiliently defending our values became of paramount importance. Mm-hmm. And you really see the explosion of the kind of highly individualistic resilience that I write about in that era, right after 9/11.
Yeah, I was fascinated to learn about the role of 9/11 in cultivating our present discourse, or the discourse of the past 20 or so years surrounding resilience, because I was 9 years old when 9/11 occurred, and I remember shortly thereafter and throughout my middle school years and high school years, messaging about resilience and grit
Absolutely.
was ever present. And I had never really traced it to 9/11. And so that makes a lot of sense, because there is, yes, this individualistic patriotism that I always unconsciously sensed in that messaging.
Right.
And to have it, identified precisely was really illuminating. Can you talk about how this term has become buzzwordified, particularly by corporate and educational environments?
Yeah, I mean, I knew it, but when I really started looking at it, I was really taken aback by the scope of it. We're talking about a multi-hundreds of millions of dollar industry of providing resilience programming and training to corporations, to schools, to the sports industry, to the military. I mean, this idea that we have to have resilient children, a resilient workforce, resilient athletes, resilient soldiers. I mean, the fact is, human beings are really remarkably resilient.
Yes,
even after,
famously.
Famously, even after terrible circumstances or horrible events, the vast majority of us are okay.
Yeah. The Ice Age, I mean, we've gotten through a lot as a species
we
now.
are okay. Yeah. But this idea that we need to work on our resilience, and we also have to pay to work on our resilience, is just ridiculous. It's really just so extreme at this point. You think, well, so I wanted to invert that and say, okay, hold on. If we know these two things, we know this industry is exploding, it's in our schools, it's in our sports, it's everywhere, and we also know that we're resilient, then shouldn't we be saying, what is our society doing to create obstacles for our resilience? What is happening that is making so many people sick and tired and feeling as though they cannot be adaptable? And so I think many of us feel we know what's happening. It's super complicated. But I would argue that one of the things that's happening, obviously, is that capitalism really isn't doing it for us anymore, right? It never really did for most people, but it's at a different stage now, And so the exploitative, racist, white supremacist, male supremacist, ableist, all of those things that we talk about they all get poured into this notion of resilience in defense of capitalist practices.
Totally. Yes. I mean, the many powers in support of hyper-capitalist society constantly come up with clever ways to victim blame or turn it around
Right.
on the individual, which is, that is a foundational dynamic in the United States.
That's right. And resilience is just bootstrapping, right? It's that notion of resilience, which doesn't have much to do with actually adapting well, is just a Horatio Alger story.
Can you elaborate on what you just said?
Sure. I mean, I think that we have these myths of resilience and we tell stories about them. And we have very famous people who are famously resilient, right? Like Oprah, famously resilient. And those stories are always focused on individuals who, this is an important word, overcome some terrible event or circumstances of childhood or life to be successful. That's the American dream. That's the American promise, right? And the notion of resilience gets distilled into this kind of ambiguously defined internal quality that comes down to character and morality and personality that you have to hone basically into a weapon against the world to be able to succeed. And that myth is at the core of this book, right? I have 10 chapters that sort of break it down to say why it's so problematic. But it's a very prevalent myth, We see it in our movies. We see it in our favorite books. We see it constantly in news coverage of disasters. And it erases the fact that people survive because they have had the experience of immense love or networks of support, or there's money, or they're embedded in their communities, or, a million other things that speak to our interdependence instead. But we don't hear much about that.
Yeah. So maybe this is just my algorithm, but on my social media feeds recently, I have seen a lot of memes. And actually, it's not just mine because a lot of people submitted questions about this very thing. I've seen a lot of memes and tweets and, people just generally sharing some version of the line like, I hope never to be called resilient ever again. Like,
Right.
I hope never to be put in the position of needing to be in survival mode so hardcore that people are constantly calling me resilient as a compliment. Mm-hmm. What do you think is responsible for what feels to me like a recent explosion in resilience discourse?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think it was happening anyway, organically over the past 10, 15 years, right? Like if you think about Hurricane Katrina, people on the ground in Katrina, particularly Black women on the ground in Katrina, were saying that, right? Like they were saying, don't call me resilient. I don't need that. I need water. I need shelter. I need food. I need the society to care for me, right? And, that's just one example that is many, many years old. I think, however, that we live in a socially and technologically accelerated world, and we happen to be living through a pandemic. And the compression that those things cause in our experience, but also our exposure to each other and our exposure to information, I think has accelerated people's exasperation with this demand, right? Like I write at one point in the book about the resilience programming in corporations and how a company like Kroger has a resilience program and has invested millions in resilience programming for its staff, and how they had frontline warrior, a whole thing. Like you and I could do this, I know, for years because of your earlier books, but the metaphors of war that are used in resilience language, right? But they had this program to train people and frontline workers who did the dangerous work of selling food during the early days of the pandemic. And yet some astounding percentage of their workers literally don't have food at home, literally are incapable of feeding their families. And that's a kind of surreal juxtaposition, right? To think that food service workers who are getting all this programming about how to develop their individual resilience and how to develop resilient corporate systems go home and cannot feed themselves or their families. That's not resilience at all. That has nothing to do with resilience.
Totally.
And yet that word is the word that's used.
Yeah, a great many listeners use the word gaslighting, self-gaslighting, which is an overused term in some contexts, but not here to describe so much resilience messaging. As you're speaking, what you're talking about is so high stakes, but in a lower stakes way, it reminds me of the skincare industry's effectiveness in presenting a problem and a fake solution to the actually fake problem in the same breath. And also in the skincare industry, there is this like totally bizarre overuse of war language. And I hear it in the nonprofit space too, because like I've done a lot of cancer fundraising over the past few years. And actually the nonprofit that I fundraise for has shifted their language in the past couple of years.
Away from war?
Away from war.
Yeah. Away from war.
But in so many of these industries, I hear phrases like, it's a battle against you and your acne. Like,
right.
It's just like, do we really need to talk about like victors and casualties? Like when we're talking about, I don't know, cellulite. What do you think is going on with that?
Well, that's interesting, right? Because in fact, I would argue that in the United States, there is nowhere where war doesn't apply.
Fair.
Okay,
fair.
So that's thing one.
We're telling on ourselves.
We're telling on ourselves. And two, we really talk about being gaslit. We live in a military-industrial complex society. You can go nowhere without militarization being evident. And we choose not to see it or to talk about it or to think about it. And that's a cultural choice, right? Like all you have to do is spend 5 minutes in another place that maybe really isn't, and you realize how prevalent it is. I mean, it's funny, I was in Germany in June, and I just couldn't get over the lack of police and surveillance technologies. And, then I went to England where they don't need police because it's all surveillance technology. I mean, everywhere has it, but our language is so profusely filled with war metaphors.
Yeah.
And same thing, actually, with epidemiology. I mean, this discussion about the virus at the beginning of the pandemic, every major world leader spoke in terms of war. And in fact, I think a lot about your Magical Thinking book because it was so clear that the resilience lessons of 9/11, go out, be American, spend your money. I mean, these were things that were said to us, right? Go shopping, be normal, don't be scared, don't be cowed, don't give in to terror. Those lessons became associated with being resilient.
Yeah.
And then when the virus happened and we made the analogy to war and to being resilient and kind of gave people the visual impression that the virus was a little terrorist running around, people didn't adapt. They used their 9/11 resilience and went out into the world because they weren't going to be cowed by a little terrorist. And that was the exact opposite of being adaptable in that moment.
Wow. Yeah. The fact that the messaging was so similar to the 9/11 messaging, the metaphors, the talk of warriors, etc., probably deeply affected how certain people who trend nationalistic anyway approach the virus. Because if you're literally imagining it as a terrorist or as a human, if you're anthropomorphizing it at all, you're going to treat it as a person. And you're not going to let yourself be ruled by fear. And that's QAnon terminology. 9/11's role in this and the ad copy that followed 9/11 has been recycled inappropriately.
And the other thing, too, I will add is that 9/11's war language was also infused by the language of invasion and disease, right? Anti-immigrant language. So you have those two things really deeply enmeshed. The language of war and the language of illness. And the bridge between them is this idea of being invaded, being penetrated, being hurt by being penetrated, right? Which I will add means more men die because they think they're impenetrable. They won't get vaccines. They won't wash their hands. Like all of these are facts, right? And you're just like, well, you're actually just human. You can be penetrated. You will be penetrated. You will die more if you don't take precautions, right? And yet we saw throughout COVID and still today that men just have much lower vaccine acceptance. They do not wash their hands as often and they end up being sicker,
Right. Oh my God. The toxic masculinity messaging is
really off the chain.
Dying for patriarchy. It's like, don't cut off your nose to spite your face here. So as you were speaking about, the Oprah examples and the other sort of like folks who've overcome, that reminded me so much of one of the cognitive biases that I wrote about in The Age of Magical Overthinking, that being survivorship bias. And especially how that applied to my best friend who was a young adult cancer survivor and made YouTube videos about her health journey. And she's such like a radiant, smiley, positive person, which is, of course, not correlated much less having a cause and effect relationship with her cancer or survival. But a lot of viewers really tried to make that connection. Like you lived because of your positive attitude, because of your resilience. And people were constantly complimenting her resilience. And my mom, who's also a survivor of the same cancer, has also expressed exasperation that, people would compliment her bravery. It's like, what would you have me do? Your cancer survival odds are not connected to your optimism or your positivity or resilience, which is not to say that, developing a positivity practice isn't a good idea for other reasons that have nothing to do with your survival. But can you talk about how exceptionalism factors in here and sort of like contaminates our self-esteem?
Well, first of all, we didn't talk about this, but what I try and illustrate in the book is the degree to which our mainstream concepts of resilience are based in domination and supremacy and hierarchy. And so that notion of exceptionalism is really important because it means you are surviving, but you're also winning. Right? And so that idea that resilience means winning, it comes at children, especially in all kinds of ways, right? Having a growth mindset, learning so you're improving, being gritty, never giving up, being a good athlete, even if you're a fucking bad athlete, right? Like the struggle to be dominant, to dominate, to win. It comes at us in all kinds of ways, And then if someone happens to get sick, it just slides over into that arena.
Totally.
That you're supposed to dominate the illness. Do you remember when Trump said that? He said, dominate the virus.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell? You were saved by doctors and nurses who have sacrificed their lives to make your life possible, right? Like, you didn't dominate the virus. That wasn't like some magical thinking in your brain that meant you were more powerful and that's how you survived. But I think that thinking is pretty prevalent.
Oh, totally. Oh, my God. I remember being struck by how quickly the language of winning and losing entered my family's world as soon as my mom was diagnosed with cancer. This idea that if you lose your battle with cancer, it's because you gave up. And if you won the battle, then you deserved it. And we want there to be those sensible cause and effect relationships, especially as Americans. It's like a gumball machine thing. I don't know.
Well, it's so American, though.
Yes.
Optimism as a trait. And I think both you and I talk and write about optimism bias. And also ideas just kind of get twisted and tessellated into directions nobody ever intended them to. Mm-hmm. So even the notion of positive psychology has been turned into a pop culture thing, fairly divorced from its origins. There's some science in the pop culture, but as you know better than anybody, often there's not. And yet that idea that you just have to stay positive and think positively, it's just in the air in the country, right? Like, that's not everywhere in the world. It's a particularly American thing.
I know. I notice it when I travel or even when I interact with like my expat friends. I think of Italians as like a pretty jubilant people. But when it comes to career, there's a lot of like, oh, I want to do this. You like express a dream that in the United States, people would be like, yes, like go
do
follow it, But in Italy, they'll be like, oh, no, just have a spritz and calm down. That's not happening. And I'm like, oh, well, okay, I'll consider that. Yeah.
Very
it was just
funny.
not having a dream would be relaxing.
Right? But also, I don't know if you're like this. Like, I really am the unfun facts person at the party. Like, I'm really terrible at small talk. And so I just go straight for the heart. This past weekend, I was at a wedding and this man that I know, I've known him for a long time, and we're really on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And we know this, and we can coexist that way. But he looks at me. He didn't know anything about this book. We hadn't seen each other in several years. And he was describing a situation, and he goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I said, actually, no. And I actually have a chapter in the book about it because it's not true.
Right.
Right. In fact, what doesn't kill you doesn't make you stronger. You might believe it is, but the people around you will attest to the fact that you may not be functioning the way you think you're functioning because you have illusions of your own self-efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. And so we talked about it for a while, and I realized that what a lot of it came down to was a person's optimism and their optimism bias versus another person's, in my case, pessimism and strategic pessimism, right? I'm like, I really endorse strategic pessimism. Like, the idea is not that you should be unhinged in your optimism because that's going to get you somewhere, but that you have the cognitive flexibility to know when to use one versus the other.
Yes. Oh my God. I love that because obviously there are a lot of well-marketed identity tests, personality tests, from astrology to Myers-Briggs to Enneagram to what have you out there. And they are fun and I love them. But I feel like whenever there's like a personality binary, people really cling to it as a bid for identity and self-discovery, and, you know, introvert and extrovert is one, and optimist and pessimist is one. And if I'm forced to choose, I guess I would call myself an optimist, but like, of course we're all allowed to have both, each at different times.
That's right. I was so excited when I found the term ambivert.
Yeah, ambivert.
I'm an ambivert. Like, I can do
see
both.
That for you.
I was like, thank you, God.
Yes.
I'm like, you know, that's that, you know.
I mean,
but yes, and all of us have those tendencies,
yes,
you know?
Yes. And it's like, you know, I'm an extrovert, but if I feel like I want to stay home one night, it's not a threat to my sense of self. Like, it doesn't have to be that deep. Okay, so I want to actually pivot to asking some of the many thought spirals that listeners submitted on this topic. They really like cut to the marrow of the general concerns about resilience that I've been seeing broadly on social media and talking about with my friends. And so, like, I just want to thank everyone who submitted a thought spiral or question. There are quite a few, so I'm going to challenge you to
speed round?
Treat this as a lightning round.
All right.
Some of them will be questions. Some of them will just be like general overthinky thoughts to react to. The first one goes like this. There are just way too many self-help books on resilience and macho energy. It's an overused word to sell.
Yes, 100%. I struggle with the self-help thing, you know, and honestly, I think people like you and I, we could be writing about Latin and it would get categorized as self-help. You just can't make it up. So yes, and the macho energy, 1,000%. I start the book with a chapter on how what we call resilience is actually just male supremacist thinking, right? And how we value those masculine attributes because we think they represent strength, which is a bullshit term anyway, because it doesn't mean anything. So I am 100% in that agreement with that comment. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that a lot of that resilience, masculine stuff gets distilled into this concept of mental toughness. And because you're a linguistics person, I think you'll appreciate this. I always invert these words, and the opposite of mental toughness is physical frailty. So it manages to capture both those ideas.
Yeah.
That you cannot be physically frail, which might mean that you're feminine, or that you have disabilities, like the entire spectrum of things that get denigrated because you're not a He-Man of the universe.
I can safely say from the reading that I've done and from my own personal observations that some of the physically muscliest people I know are the most mentally frail. frail,
I say.
Yes,
I agree with
frail,
you.
I say. The next thought spiral goes like this. Is resilience just a way to put what should be a communal thing on an individual?
Absolutely. That's my whole book.
That's
my book was an exercise in overthinking, literally an exercise in overthinking. Didn't have to be overthought to that degree, you know, but that's it. That's the book. And it's not just that it should be on the community. It's that our resilience ideals actively work against the idea that we should have community and that we are naturally mutually dependent and fragile beings.
Absolutely. Okay, some of these are a little more personal and kind of rhetorical. Obviously, they're impossible to answer, but worth discussing anyway. Someone says, and this is just an internal thought spiral of theirs, am I faking being resilient so people aren't uncomfortable around me?
I do that.
Oh my God, me too. Me too. People are like, how are you doing? And I've like just been in like a heaving panic 30 minutes
Yes.
beforehand. I'm like, oh, look around, no complaints, you know?
Right. Although I will say this happens to me sometimes where someone will ask me how I'm doing and I tell them.
Yeah.
I'm like, actually, word vomit, right? And I sense maybe this is the case with you too. And I think many people feel very comfortable divulging their
Yes.
secrets and their problems. And honestly, it can be super overwhelming.
Yeah.
Because you're just standing there at a book talk or at the park and literally someone will say, you know, my daughter was sexually assaulted this weekend. And I'm just like, oh, wait, what? And so that notion that you have to be resilient for other people is also really, I write about that a lot in the book, because in general, women are not taught how to be resilient for themselves, but to be resilient resources for other people.
Right.
And I think that's part of feminine socialization.
Absolutely. The next one goes, why would we rather praise someone for resilience than allow them to be hurt?
That's also such a great question. I think it's because our culture is contemptuous of need. It's contemptuous of care. It's contemptuous, as we've been saying, of our inherent fragility. Probably the most sort of virally influential recent book on resilience, and mine does not count as those things, is a book that was written a few years ago called Anti-Fragile. I've read that book, and will Sneidney say that it gives me pause that, you know, there are very few women mentioned in that book, and that the ones that are mothers and nannies. And, you know, I could go down that path for a whole day if you wanted me to. But I think that notion that we're not supposed to be what we are, like, you know, women have to deal every day with the fragility of the body, whether it's their own or children or the elderly. It's a real luxury to pretend we're not.
So well put. The next one goes, generational trauma. Like, am I a strong woman or am I just traumatized?
Oh, that's really, it's not funny, but I think it's funny because I decided long ago, so I'm 58, and I didn't know what the word anxiety was when I was plagued with anxiety as a 25-year-old, had no idea what it was. Definitely intergenerational trauma, which I've written about too. My book, Rage Becomes Her, follows 4 generations of women in my family. And I think there's a very close relationship between those things. I kind of laugh when I see all the internet talk about first daughters. It's like the tests you take, the tests you were just referring to, because some of it is so true.
What's your favorite first daughter sort of like soundbite?
Oh my God, my first, I mean, I don't even know. I just, it's also recognizable to me. Like, I don't know, protecting my parents, protecting my siblings.
The world is run by first daughters. I see a lot of
the world is run by first daughters, but I read some of them and I just laugh.
Yeah.
You know, we went home to the Bahamas where my whole family's there, and we're Bahamian, and I'm the eldest daughter, and my husband is like, "What is going on here? Why is everything? Why are you the clearinghouse? You don't even live here." You know, and it's true. It just happens, you know. So yes, I think that there's intergenerational trauma, there's inherited trauma. It doesn't matter to me if it's coded in your DNA. Like, there's a whole debate over that, and it's irrelevant.
Totally.
Because if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And it's going to happen whether your DNA has been... We know that trauma causes DNA changes. Like, people who grew up starving, there is a genetic legacy that they pass on, right? But also, like, if we really wanted to talk about trauma and inherited change, all of us have it. The history of human beings to this point
is defined by trauma.
Is defined by trauma.
Yeah. The next one goes, is there more or less of an expectation today to have a thick skin in the workplace?
Oh, I don't know that can really be answered. I mean, I think the internet and our exposure to more information than ever before requires everybody in every context to develop tools that we aren't ever taught about. Like, we're looking at war in person. We're looking at vicious rapes in, like, they're just on our phones. We carry them in our pocket. And nobody's really teaching children or adults what vicarious trauma looks like or what secondary... I mean, many people, I can see the signs online. Like, this past weekend, you know, there were 4 or 5 horrific, globally high-profile cases of violence against women. The Olympiad burnt to death, the French woman raped by 90 men at the invitation of her husband. Like, there's so many of those.
Yeah.
And people have a visceral response and they pass it on because they want it to stop. But in fact, stories like that cause trauma. It's not just the events that cause trauma to the people living through them.
Yeah.
It is witnessing those things that also can cause trauma.
Yeah. We're just not made for it, and we're not talking about it. Are some children born more resilient than others?
Amazingly, yes and no.
Okay,
So
okay.
I do write about it a lot. There are these categories of children: orchids, dandelions, tulips. I've given these names. The kids that we think of as the least resilient, the sensitive children, the anxious children, the children prone to depression. It turns out that with the right environment and the right nurture, those children over time become the most resilient adults. If they do not get the nurture, the love, the space that they need, they will suffer as adults tremendously. Mm-hmm. And so those kids are also the people who grow up to be our artists, our visionaries, our kind of spiritual leaders, because they have a sensitivity to the world. They're genetically inclined in that way. In our society, children like that tend to suffer enormously because our system wants conformity.
Yes.
And it wants toughness. And when you try and force a kid like that to conform and be tough, it actively hurts them.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
And so there's a lot of studies about this. There's some people whose particular genetic combination, very small number of people, is resistant to anything. Right? And that's kind of sad. But there are, in fact, kids, these dandelion kids, you put them anywhere and they're like, yeah, I'm good. But they don't enjoy pleasure or pain because they're not particularly sensitive in either way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they don't have the euphoric experiences, the transcendent experiences, for example, that one of these quote-unquote sensitive kids has.
Okay. Next thought spiral goes, is it resilience or is it a disconnection from emotions in order to succeed?
100%. 100%.
The latter. Yeah.
You know, emotional rigidity, emotional repression. I do write a lot about this because the sensitive boys in particular are penalized. And it's one of the constraints of masculinity that you're stronger when you aren't emotional like women are, girls are, you know. And so I think we're really seeing there's the high cost of that in our society.
Thank God I have, call me an optimist, but I do see glimmers of hope that those standards are slowly changing. Like, I have really soft men in my life, like really like sensitive, sweet men who just like love picking herbs. They're like, they would have been totally vilified and ostracized 30 years ago or 50 years ago. And they're like thriving and in these bubbles, like, okay, like
I think in these bubbles.
But like, that has to be a good sign, right?
You know, it's really hard to gauge because one of the more disturbing things that I've seen recently is that 50% of men under 30 are Trump supporters. I can really see it. I really do intensely study this almost every day. We're seeing such a retrogression of men into conservatism compared to women. And what's funny about that is it's not just misogyny or resentment or aggrieved entitlement. It's anti-democratic. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, we never associate being anti-feminist with political instability when in fact it's deeply driving global political instability, resentment of women's equality, right? And so I know the men you're talking about. You know, I have really wonderful male friends who are all the things you just said, but I am acutely aware that they are not the norm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I know that they're not the norm, but I guess I'm just so lucky. I feel it every day. Like, I'm so lucky to have these boys. All right, this is personal, and again, it's one of these that can't be answered. When can my queer Latino self stop being resilient and just start being?
That's a hard one to answer.
Do you have hope, Soraya?
I do have hope. I think the key thing, honestly, always in that situation is to find the people. There are people that will love you. And the people who can't love you for whatever reason shouldn't be defining how you live. That's hard because often those people are your family.
Well stated. All right, 2 more. Is it resilience or is it ADHD masking 40 years in the making?
Oh my God, that could be me too.
Hashtag relatable.
That's so funny. I can't answer that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I remember when I learned the word masking. I was like, oh, fuck.
This is when the kind of labeling language is really useful and beautiful. So one of my last questions is just simply, what can we do? How can we reimagine notions of resilience in our minds to help deal with these values that we've been encouraged to abide by that ultimately end up causing us a lot of pain, notions of perfectionism and toughness? How can we reorient ourselves around those?
So I think, I thought a lot about this. And one of the ideas that really struck me that I think can help shift people away from thought spirals. Because I think thought spirals, you may disagree with me, often come down to me. What am I doing? How can I change? What can I do wrong? What's the panic? What's the anxiety?
Yeah.
Like all the things, right? And in the book, I say the thing about resilience is we're supposed to think it's all on us. We're supposed to be more resilient. And if we're not, there's something wrong with us and we have to fix that problem, right? It's a perfectionism thing too. But I think that instead of thinking the opposite of resilience is strength, for example, what we should do is think instead that it's loneliness. Because in order to be resilient, we need each other. Mm-hmm. And it's not just on us, right? Like a lot of the thought spirals, at least related to resilience, might be, why am I not strong enough? Why am I not optimistic? Why am I feeling down? Why am I so fragile? Like all of these things we're not supposed to be. But in fact, it's not us. It's our interrelationships, right? If we can think of resilience as an adapting, forget the word resilience if it's not a good thing, that word for you. If we can think of how to change and adapt, if we think relationally, it kind of diffuses the spiral. It's like, oh, I need to find the people that will listen to me and hear me and care for me. And there should be zero shame in that, right?
Yes. Thank you for that. My only other sort of outro question is, what do you think is the one thing about resilience that we're overthinking generally? And what is the one thing you think we're underthinking?
I mean, honestly, the thing we're overthinking is that we have to work so hard. And the thing we're underthinking is how chronically inept our society is at helping people, not just helping them adapt to hardship, but avoiding the hardship to begin with. Giving people food, giving them water, giving them shelter, giving them clean air, giving them tree spaces. Like, we're just a really cravenly, toxically individualistic society.
It's so true. And I will spend my life disentangling that, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again. I appreciate your time.
Well, I just love seeing you, love talking to you. Thank you so much.
And thank you, listeners, so much for tuning in. Now's the time in the episode when I offer a piece of evidence-based, actionable advice for how we overthinkers can get out of our own heads this week. This one I pulled from Soraya's book, The Resilience Myth, and it has to do with playing Tetris, yes, the computer or iPhone game, to navigate through mental trauma. Soraya writes about how during one of the most grief-stricken times in her life, when grief, quote, suffused every cell in her body and was physically painful, one of the ways she responded was to play Tetris every single night, which was a comforting, lifelong habit of hers. She writes in the book, quote, hyper-focusing on virtual geometric pieces tumbling down the screen not only distracted me, but may also have helped reduce the emotional intensity and potentially traumatizing effects of my experiences, a benefit that neither I, nor I imagine the game's Russian inventor, had anticipated. And there's actual science behind the healing qualities of Tetris. Soraya goes on to write that in 2010, some researchers from Oxford University's Department of Psychiatry conducted a study that revealed how playing Tetris reduced the intensity of traumatic memories and stopped them from intruding voluntarily. The researchers said that Tetris could serve as, quote, a cognitive vaccine against the sort of intrusive, vivid, disruptive, reoccurring thoughts that are often associated with PTSD. This is one of several studies that have illuminated what is called, quote, dual task processing, a way to reroute memories and minimize or even eliminate traumatic stress. So, if you're going through an especially tough mental time, You might even consider giving Tetris a try. And with that, thank you again for listening. And until the next thought spiral, think it over. Just don't overthink it. Magical Overthinkers was created and hosted by Amanda Montell and edited by Jordan Moore of The Pod Cabin. Our theme music is by Casey Kolb. Thank you to our magical coordinator, Katie Epperson, producer, Rebecca Swan, and Network Studio 71. Be sure to follow the pod on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. We're also on YouTube, link in show notes, and ad-free episodes as well as behind-the-scenes extras are available on the Magical Overthinkers Substack at amandamontell.substack.com.